Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today I have a real treat. I get to have a conversation with an old friend that I haven't really had a good talk with for 25 years, has it been? Something like that. And this is Seth Klein. And when I knew Seth, he was a high school kid
Yeah.
traveling around Canada trying to tell high school students why they should oppose nuclear weapons. Boy, he did a great job of it, and with three of his high school friends. And one time I had to go away, and I was teaching at the university at a course, which I thought would be fine for him. So he pinch hit for me. When I went away, he taught my course for a while. And I got good reports on how it was that this high school kid was teaching my undergraduate class, and really they were lapping it up. Anyway, hello, Seth Klein.
Hi, Meta. Nice to see you after all this time.
It is wonderful to see you. And this is a time for us to get caught up, if you, the audience, don't mind a little bit. I want to find out what's happened in the last 25 or so years, because I do know what you've been doing for something like 22 of those years.
Mm-hmm.
You were the director of, what is it called? The
The
Canadian
Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives in British
Yeah,
Columbia. Yes.
has to be one of the great, if not the greatest, Canadian think tank, right?
Well, I think so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I finished up school, university in Toronto when you and I knew each other, and I very briefly taught high school in
Did
Toronto,
you?
and then I moved out here, and I was a teacher fleetingly, and then went back to grad school, and I was hired to open up the BC office of the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives in the mid-90s, and I spent 22 years there until I decided to leave a year and a half ago and write a book.
Yeah. Well, I've had a good look at your book. I can't say
Oh, yeah.
pretty long book. I didn't.
Here's the
It
book.
is. That's great. It's wonderful. Love the title, A Good War. I
Oh, I'm
was,
glad you like it. I was nervous you'd hate it.
oh no. Oh, no, I almost was. I was going to write a book called The Good Fight,
Oh, there you go. Okay.
but I don't think I ever did any of it. I was just thinking about it. But anyway, this is a good title. And yeah, because, they talked of World War II as the good war. And you have to say, if there ever was a good war, a justifiable war, and we could spend our rest of our life talking about that, World War
And that
II
would be
has
it.
to be one that is pretty hard to see how you could escape that.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm an unlikely person, as we both know, to have written a war story.
Yeah.
And because, as you said in the intro, as a kid, I cut my political teeth in the peace and disarmament movement. I'm actually the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's why I'm Canadian. My parents
Hmm.
moved to Montreal, pregnant with me when my dad was drafted. I'm as surprised as anyone that I've written a war story. And I should say I didn't initially intend to. I left the CCPA intending to write a book on the climate crisis, increasingly alarmed about the climate crisis, and increasingly alarmed by this persistent, harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And what can we do about that, and how can we close that gap? I had always intended to include a chapter on World War II, because I've always just been intrigued by the fact that we retooled the whole economy so quickly during World War
Hmm.
II. And to me, all of us who wonder, can we really do this in time? The answer is, yeah, we can, because we've done it before. In fact, we did it twice in 6 years, once to ramp up wartime production and another time to reconvert to peacetime. But the more I delved into that research, the more I kept seeing these parallels all over the place, and not just with respect to that economic conversion, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around lessons from the Second World War. So hence the title, The Good War, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency.
Well, a person actually could get pretty good history. Just, if you only read the book for the history, it would be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I enjoyed the history part of it. And
Yeah.
so every chapter jumps back and forth in time. Um, each chapter is really kind of a third a history book and two-thirds
Mhm.
present climate emergency,
Mhm.
but tries to pull out these lessons. And so, as a structure, how did we mobilize public opinion for the Second World War? Lessons for today. How did we forge unity across confederation? Lessons for today.
Mhm.
How did we reorganize the economy? Lessons for today. How did we mobilize labor? Lessons for today. What did we do for returning soldiers? And is that a model for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? How did we pay for it then? Lessons for today. What was the role of civil society and indigenous people and youth then and now? And importantly, because it is a war story, what are the cautionary tales? So, while I spend the bulk of the book lauding what we did and the speed and scale of it,
Mhm.
we also have to go eyes wide open into this about the things that happened that caused us shame and that we wouldn't want to repeat. And so the book deals with that too.
Mhm. Well, because I am American also, and I still have dual citizenship, by the way. I don't know, do your parents?
My parents are dual citizen. I used to have dual citizenship, but I gave up my US citizenship some
Okay.
time ago.
Uh-huh. But I was brought up during the war. I remember Pearl Harbor very well, and
Wow.
I remember moving around and working in the army camps and so on. World War II is very vivid for me, but it's the American experience and not the Canadian experience. And I think both countries were amazing in the mobilization, the rapidity
Mhm.
of this extraordinary capacity that we built in no time. But
Yes.
then I learned a few things about Mackenzie King and C.D.
Yeah.
Howe, who was only a
Yes.
name to me. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate having this kind of little history lesson, which I never got because I didn't go to school here.
Right. I mean, so the book is very much written for Canadians and rooted in our history, and the realities of Canadian Confederation and the realities of Indigenous rights and title here, and the realities of our current political context. But you're right too that there's similarities and important differences around the US and Canadian mobilization. One of the what they have in common, I think, and again, because in the context of climate, I think so many people think like our politicians just seem to be in denial about this, and nothing ever seems to happen. And so I took some solace from the fact that in both Canada and the US, our leaders then too were not keen to do this, and were really blind to the threat before them until the 11th hour, and even more so in the US. So people often, when I would tell them I was writing this book, they would say, "Oh, well, back then everyone understood the threat to be clear and present." Well, no, actually, they didn't, especially not if you were in North America. Um, and Canada, interestingly, didn't wait on the United States. So Canada declared war 2 years before the United States, and for a long time was the only country in the Western Hemisphere to have declared war. The US did require an attack on its soil, so to speak,
That's
before they
interesting
jumped in.
because I think my guess is that the U.S. would not have entered the war except for Pearl Harbor.
Well, it's who's to know in hindsight. I do in the chapter on how we mobilize public opinion. I note that there's a section in there about the role of the media, and the U.S. media, particularly the CBS News crew with Edward R. Murrow, certainly played an important role in shifting U.S. opinion about entry into the war even before Pearl Harbor. They are largely credited with a 20 percentage point shift in public opinion about entering the war even before Pearl Harbor.
Oh,
And that helped
one
lay the groundwork.
one news channel or broadcasting company?
The CBS News, the CBS News.
Okay.
And, because back when you were a kid, everyone listened to the same news, right? And would gather around the radio and would hear those reports.
Mhm.
In fact, throughout the book, I try to make a point of these amazing people who, in the face of a crisis, decide to break the rules. And there's an interesting story about Edward R. Murrow in that regard, which is that on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland, the bosses at CBS headquarters in New York had decided there'd been too much bad news. And so they cable Edward R. Murrow, who's the CBS man in London, and they say, "Look, all the European bureau chiefs. You're gonna have a big song and dance show with highlighting all of the popular music across Europe. Liven things up a little. And Murrow calls his counterpart at CBS office in Berlin, and he says, "Look, we've just been told by headquarters that this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to do it." And instead, they were there on the ground covering the Nazi invasion of Poland, and then spent the next 2 years shifting American public opinion. But also the U.S., I'm sorry to spend so much time on the U.S., but they were planning all through those 2 years. And so when you think about the speed of the change, consider this. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 41, and the U.S. declared war. In February of 42, so 2 months later, the last civilian automobile came off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, the production and sale of the private automobile in the US, the center of car culture, was effectively illegal. Now those plants were all busy, and all those workers were busy doing something else. But that's what I'm trying to get at the book, around what does it look and feel like when we actually treat an emergency as an emergency?
Well, already you've given the answer. There was already work for them. There was something for them to do. You didn't just lay them off.
That's
and
right.
I think maybe that's something we better think about. And
absolutely.
It takes, it can't be done in a haphazard way. You can't just lay off people and hope somebody else thinks to hire them.
That's right. You got a plan. You got a plan. Now, the good news with the climate emergency is that there's a great deal of work that's going to need to be done, but it needs to be coordinated, it needs to be planned, and we need to make sure that, it's not all the same jobs in the same places, and so that people are supported through that transition. But again, and let me come back to Canada to give a sense of why I think we can do this. In World War II, Canada was a population of a little over 11 million people. Of that base, over 1 million people enlisted, and more than that were directly involved in military production. And they all had to be trained up, and they all had to be reconverted back to peacetime afterwards. That is far, far more people than are currently employed in fossil fuel production in Canada today, with a population more than 3 times larger. So we need to approach it with the same level of ambition, but actually it's not as big a job.
Okay, talk about the money too. By the way, did you major in economics or something? Because your work has always been, at least at the Canadian Centre, you've been dealing with economic issues more than anything else, right?
Yeah, well, my undergrad was in international relations at your university, and so that was partly economics, and I did my MA in political economy. So, and it was a major focus of my work at the CCPA.
Good, because you can actually add and subtract, and I have a little trouble with that. But I do have some questions about a cost. If we want to make this emergency, which react to it as an emergency, which we're not going to have any argument about that. I absolutely, and I think that public opinion now is coming around to seeing that, my God, the forest fires are going to get us, if nothing else, or the floods or whatever. I don't know.
Well, and I did some polling as part of my book research, which affirms what you're saying. The terrain has shifted in the last 2 years in public opinion in Canada, and a majority of Canadians do see climate as an emergency. And I actually think are ahead of our politics on this front.
I tend to agree. I don't know why that happens. I mean, we live in a democracy, and yet sometimes it sure doesn't look like it. The responsiveness of our government is usually leaves much to be desired, I think, somehow. But I also was talking to, by the way, last week I did an interview with 2 people about Project Drawdown. So I'm very much thinking about these days about climate change and about things like the various things that need to be done to get us there, to the point where we have this inflection point and start having less carbon in the air.
But you were asking about cost.
The first thing I asked them, I knew the answer, but I asked them anyway to tell me how much this is going to cost if we actually do this stupendous effort. Now, let me ask you.
Well, I have a figure that I propose in the book. Nicholas Stern has said that what we need to spend is something in the order of 2% of GDP, specifically on climate mitigation measures and infrastructure. I think we should be spending more than that, because I actually think we should be embracing something like a Green New Deal for Canada. And that's not just climate infrastructure, it's also the social infrastructure, it's also the childcare and the housing that tackle inequality. So let's double that. Let's say it was 4% of GDP. In the Canadian context, that's about $100 billion a year. And we can absolutely do that for a number of years. Interestingly, all of this pales again in comparison to what we had to do in the Second World War. In the Second World War, Canada's GDP doubled out of that spending. And Canada's debt to GDP ratio at the end of the Second World War was 108%. So, and that remains an historic high. And yet it presaged this 30-year period of record economic performance. And let me compare it to COVID, right? So in response to COVID, we are seeing actually the government acting like it's an emergency. And what happens in an emergency is you spend what you have to spend. C.D. Howe famously said in World War II, when pressed about the spending, if we lose, nothing will matter. So the government is spending what they need to spend. The federal deficit this year is going to be over $300 billion. The debt to GDP ratio is going to increase about 15%, from about 35% to 50%. But that's still half what it was at the end of the Second World War. But the other thing that's happening now in response to COVID, which we haven't seen since the Second World War, is the role of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada has been buying up $5 billion in government securities a week since the start of the pandemic. And their holdings of Canadian government debt have increased in just the last few months from about 15% of the total to almost 35% of the total.
All right, so, now you're going to have to help me here. I hear you, but I really don't know what that means. Why would they?
What it means is what it means is that the Bank of Canada is effectively creating money, hand over fist, and that all of this government deficit spending we're seeing in response to COVID is effectively us borrowing from ourselves. The Bank of Canada is our own crown corporation.
Which will mean inflation?
Well, so the risk of creating money in that way is that it would produce inflation, or that it would collapse.
What I'd heard, that's almost the definition of how you get inflation.
Yes, except that no economist right now believes inflation is a threat, because the other parts of the economy are battered so badly. It only becomes a risk of inflation if the creation of money exceeds the capacity of the economy. But there's so much slack in the economy right now because everyone's been so battered by COVID that there's no risk at all. The only other risk would be that your currency becomes devalued, but the good news is, because everyone's in the same boat, that's not happening either. So this is, and they're able to issue bonds and securities at incredibly low interest rates that we haven't seen since the Second World War. All of which means there's actually zero reason not to be spending like gangbusters right now. And I would say the good news actually is that as we turn our attention to COVID recovery, I think there's actually fairly wide agreement across the political spectrum and among economists that the recovery is going to have to be state-led, for the simple reason that the private sector is going to be in no position to do so. They've been too whacked. And the only real debate is going to be, what form will that government investment take? Will it be investment to rebuild or restore the old, or will it be to catapult us into the new? That's really the only debate.
Well, let me move back and answer the question that I left dangling. What they said about, what Drawdown, and his answer was, it won't cost us a cent. We'll make money from it.
Well, so there are these private yeah.
He acknowledges, of course, that there's money up front, but that the long-term effect of all of these 100 interventions, or almost all of them, I think there are one or two exceptions, refrigeration being one, but almost all of the things that can be done to solve the drawdown situation will actually save us money in the long run. And they've got numbers, for what it's worth. I can't calculate with them, but they do make an effort to estimate how much the cost will be and what the long-term effects will be.
So it depends. There's truth to parts of this, but I also think that we shouldn't try to, sell a false bill of goods to people. It is going to cost up front. We are going to have to spend, and our governments are going to have to spend to expedite the transition, just as they did in the Second World War. Am I worried about that? No, I'm not worried about that at all. Now, it's also true that a bunch of the spending has to be at the private level, whether it's businesses or households spending themselves to change how to electrify everything, basically. And it is true that some of that actually saves you money down the road. And so, I'll give you personal examples. I don't drive a fossil fuel car anymore. I have an electric car and an electric bike. And I've gotten all the natural gas out of my house and replaced it with electric heat pumps and with solar panels. Now, the solar panels were pricey up front, but to your point, they will save me money over time. They'll pay for themselves 3 times over in reduced electricity costs. The switch off of natural gas to the electric heat pumps is not going to save me money because electricity is pretty cheap relative to natural gas, and it was expensive to get it done. The car costs money up front, but it definitely saves money over time and savings from having to buy gas and maintenance. So are there savings from over time? Yes. Bigger picture at a societal level, the argument I'm trying to make in the book is that it's a better life. When we build communities where you don't even need cars because everything that you need is closer by, and you save on insurance and all of those things. When your health is better, when you're eating better, the savings to the healthcare system are better, and it's a good life. But I don't want to be an ingenue about the fact that we do require billions of dollars of upfront investment. And where I get a little worried about, there's definitely a school within the climate movement that basically says that it's a money-making opportunity and the private sector is going to lead us out of this. And I disagree with that strongly. Yeah. I do. This is going to have to be state-led. And again, that was the key lesson out of the Second World War. The private sector had a big role to play in military production in the Second World War, but what it wasn't allowed to do is to determine the allocation of scarce resources, because we don't do that in an emergency. C.D. Howe, who you mentioned off the top, who was no lefty, right? I mean, he was on the right wing of the Liberal Party, but he created 28 crown corporations to get the job done. He was carefully controlling and coordinating all the necessary supply chains to prioritize military production.
I noticed that you recommend the creation of at least one crown corporation in each sector. Explain what you would mean by that. How many sectors are there, and what would these crown corporations do for us? Why do we need them?
Well, so let's go back to what C.D. Howe did. So here's a private sector guy. He's happy to give contracts to his private sector friends, but he's an engineer in a hurry, and he's seized with the emergency of the Second World War. And so anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what he needed done, he created another crown corporation. But he also, remember, there was nothing in the way of military production to speak of in Canada before the Second World War. And so he's letting all these contracts out to the private sector, and nobody actually knows what it costs. Now, the risk when no one knows what it costs is that these private sector contractors are going to bilk you. So what does he do? He creates a crown basically in each major defense sector, in airplanes, in ships, in arms production, in vehicles, so that he has a public sector comparator and knows what it actually costs. And that was the same logic behind the government's creation of Petro-Canada in the 70s. You want to have a public competitor to kind of keep an eye on these things and make sure some of the returns go to the public. So when I looked at what Howe had done in the Second World War, I kind of went through this exercise of saying, okay, by the same logic, what would those new generation crown corporations be today? And I think we should do what C.D. Howe did. We should, first of all, take an inventory of everything we're going to need to decarbonize our society. How many electric buses? How many electric heat pumps? How many solar arrays? How many wind farms? And then you do a survey of what production capacity exists, and then you figure out how to fill the gap. And often that should take the form of a crown corporation to maximize the benefits. I'll give you another personal example. I mentioned before that we just went through the process, my wife and I, of getting the natural gas out of our house and getting electric heat pumps. Now, it was expensive. And it was frankly more expensive than it should have been. I had lots of contractors in the house giving me prices and this kind of thing. And you kind of feel the same way you do every time you try to take your car to a mechanic, and you never know what you can believe. So what if, and it's all expensive because it's all imported. So what if we had a crown corporation that was mass producing HFC-free electric heat pumps in Canada? Get the profit margin out, get the economies of scale, have an army of installers who go to your house and tell you how to do it, where you can have confidence that nobody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes. You could shave thousands of dollars off the cost of making this switch at a household level.
That's going to be hard to sell.
You think? Well, I mean,
a capitalist society, my
yeah.
friend.
Well, so this is. It's interesting you should say that. So one of the barriers to change I think we face, then I spend a section of the book talking about it, is the legacy of neoliberalism that has sapped our imagination and our ambition. And so when you think, well, why isn't the government spending what it needs to spend? Why aren't they investing? Why is it that even NDP governments in Alberta until recently, and here in British Columbia where I am, aren't creating new crown corporations like they used to tackle this emergency? And it's because, neoliberalism dies hard, and it's there like a shadow over all across the political spectrum, telling these governments that the only thing they can do is incentivize change. But here's the point about an emergency. We've all just experienced it with the pandemic. In an emergency, you're liberated. You spend what you have to spend. You create whole new institutions like the CERB. And that's what we need to do for climate.
But look, in terms of the downfall of neoliberalism, I'm going to predict it. I think there are really two issues that maybe you need to speak to, because it's becoming conscious in the general population. One is that corporations are not exactly democratic, not exactly accountable to anybody, and pretty too big for their britches. So we have to do something to tame corporations, and I think more and more people are aware of that as a real problem, which they wouldn't have been 15 years ago. And the other is the question, which I don't think you've addressed yet. Is all of this going to, or is the progress of technology and automation going to kill the jobs that already exist? And what do we need to do to create jobs, or at least to create the income that jobs have? There's, I think, the COVID experience and the government payout for helping unemployed people or people in feeling the pinch has demonstrated that there can be something like a universal basic income. And that, I think, is going to happen. I just predict it something like that will happen. It makes sense. So we have, that leaves you with, what do you do about corporations anyway?
Right.
Regardless of whether it's an emergency or not, we've got a threat to democracy on a lot of fronts, not just that, but one of them is corporations.
And you're right, we got to do
your
something.
Solution, Phil.
Well, and it's interesting, just today, actually, my old friends at the CCPA published a little report that the 20 wealthiest Canadians have seen a jump in their wealth since the beginning of the pandemic of $37 billion. So inequality is a theme that runs through all of this, and it is a barrier to mobilization, as well as a threat to our democracy. And so this is, again, one of the areas where the more I started to learn about that World War II history, the more fascinating I found it. So let's go back even further in history. In the First World War, much like in this pandemic, there have been rampant and grotesque profiteering. And that profiteering had undermined social solidarity. It had undermined recruitment efforts in the First World War, and it had led to the government having to bring in conscription. Because what did it mean to have some people volunteering their lives while other people are making a killing? Mackenzie King was acutely aware of all of this at the beginning of the Second World War. He had lived through it. He had been in Laurier's cabinet. He had seen how the conscription crisis had torn apart the country and his party. And so one of his principal political objectives at the outset of the Second World War was to avoid mandatory military conscription. So he has this formidable challenge then. How do you get hundreds of thousands of people to voluntarily offer up their lives? And you need social solidarity for that. And he knew it. So he starts to bring in these incredible measures to tackle inequality and to prevent profiteering. The corporate tax rate in World War II went from 18 to 40%. They brought in an excess profits tax that was extraordinary. You know what? This is how they did it. They went back to the 4 years before World War II. And for every industry, they looked at the profits in those 4 years, still depression years, right? They averaged it out and they said to every business, big and small in the land, that's your annual limit until the end of the war.
Really?
It was meaning not only did the corporate income tax rate go from 18 to 40%, but once you hit that average from before the war, your marginal tax rate was 100%. And businessmen at the time, gave speeches to their colleagues about why they had to suck it up and accept this, because this is what it means to confront an emergency. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, World War II also saw, even though we were dealing with all of the spending needs of military production and all these other things, and this is shades of a Green New Deal, they also brought in the first major income transfer programs in Canadian history. Unemployment insurance comes in 1940. The family allowance comes in 1944. The Marsh Report, which is really the report that is the architecture of the whole post-war Canadian social welfare state, is written during the Second World War. And it becomes part of a promise that the King government has to make, frankly, or they're going to lose an election to the CCF, that to all of these people who they're asking to enlist and all of these soldiers overseas, we promise that you will return to a different country than the one that you left. That's how you mobilize people. So I think we need to do that again as part of this, and that means tackling inequality. It means we need excess profits taxes again.
It means a Green New Deal.
And it means something like a Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. And by the way, in the opinion polling I referenced before, you see the power of this. So not only in the polling I did with Abacus Research do you find very high levels of support for bold climate action in Canada, but when you ask people additionally, well, would you become more or less supportive if we increased transfers to low-income households, if we offered a good jobs guarantee to fossil fuel workers, if we increased taxes on the wealthy and corporations, support for that bold climate action doesn't go down, it grows through the roof.
Well, my friend, explain Donald Trump to me then. Well, I mean, my friend Arlie Hochschild is one who I mean, her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, was really the thing that made me rethink everything I kind of had assumed about political allegiance.
Mm.
I mean, she shows very obviously, she starts off with the point that the red states in the US are the states that need the most government support and help, and they are the most opposed to it.
Yeah.
And here you have a large proportion of the electorate deciding that they voting for things that are absolutely diametrically opposed to their own interests.
So this is
Completely
why
irrational, and it's based on nothing but some sort of joining. Do you support this baseball club or the other one?
not completely irrational. This is why I think the power. This is the power and importance of the Green New Deal. It's why tackling the climate emergency has to be linked to inequality, and it speaks to the failure of the U.S. Democratic Party establishment. When you fail to link the need for these things to inequality, then you allow climate change to be presented as an elitist project, which is exactly what Donald Trump did.
Yeah, but it's worse than that. I mean, these are people who know that out in their backyard people are dumping waste that have killed the members of their own family, and they know that who's died because of it. And if you say, "Don't you want the EPA to come in and clean this up?" they'll say no. So
I mean,
this has to be irrational in any sense of the word.
Yeah, well, and people are hurting. I see these parallels again to this pre-war period, right? We live in this moment where things can go either way. And look at the 1930s and the economic despair across the world then. The economic despair that gave birth both to the New Deal and Roosevelt in the United States and elected Hitler, right? In the same way that we live in a time that holds up the promise of a Green New Deal at the same time as it elects Donald Trump and Duterte and Bolsonaro and all the rest of these guys, and Modi and all of the rest of these people who speak, they're all speaking to the same anxiety and the same feeling of alienation and rejection that so many people feel. One set of people are offering up scapegoats, the other and animating our worst selves, and another set of people are trying to animate our best selves.
I would have to say probably the Democratic leaders are not completely crazy when they say we can't try to promote Bernie or the Green New Deal. We have to go with some moderate like Biden. And Biden, is trying to still win over the folks who voted for Trump.
I hope they're right. But I'm somebody who believes that Bernie could have won 4 years ago.
I know that he could. I'm sure that he could have won against Hillary. I mean, the number
or against Trump. Against Trump is the point. If he had won, then
he could have beaten Trump.
But that's the point, because
now I don't know. I mean, maybe they're right in choosing Biden now rather than
what's done is done, and I hope you're right. But I think the thing about sort of ancient history now 4 years ago, but partly what made Hillary Clinton an awful candidate is that the things that were said about her and the elitism and the fact that the Democratic Party didn't give a hoot about ordinary people were true. But if it had been Trump and Bernie Sanders, who both were speaking to that feeling of alienation and inequality and corporate power, people could have voted for the real deal.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to find out some things. And I don't know, the other question is whether the pandemic is going to change public opinion in any radical way. And I don't see it happening yet.
Oh, well, this is where, just to bring it back to my book, the timing of all of this has been so weird, Meta. I wrote my book before the pandemic. I had shipped my book off for final copy edit 3 days before the pandemic. And the whole premise of my book was that we needed this historic reminder of how quickly we're capable of moving when we see crises as the emergency as they are. And then the pandemic hit, and now we're all living through that reminder in real time. We're all experiencing it. And it's been brutal for a lot of people. But I actually think in some ways, and it has pushed the climate emergency for now, at least off the front burner. I did quickly write a new epilogue to the book about COVID and all the parallels between the climate emergency and the pandemic and the war. And I think there are many. But I think in some ways, we will come out of the pandemic well placed for the fact that we all come out with a renewed appreciation for the importance of the role of government. We have a level of social solidarity and national unity that we haven't had in a generation. We see the connections between inequality and these emergencies. And in terms of that government spending and the role of the Bank of Canada that I was talking about before, the cat's out of the bag now. Now what we've been shown is what was possible all along. If the government had chosen to see these things as emergencies.
Well, that people say that about the basic income idea too, guaranteed annual income. That now we see they could have done that, 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether that, but I haven't seen any poll results showing remarkable changes. Now it's been 6 months we've had this pandemic so far, and I don't know of any dramatic changes in public opinion. I do know that I'm really happy about the fact that people are actually, I think instead of a less social interaction, I think there's more social interaction now.
Mm-hmm.
I think
I know my neighbors better than I ever did.
Yeah, on Zoom, I spend 2 or 3 hours a day on Zoom, and I'm not alone, So, and I think this kind of conversation going on is really a very important thing. I think too many people until recently have rushed out into the streets. It's easy, to mobilize people with Twitter or something that say, come to such and such a corner at such and such a time, and people will come, but they don't know each other and they don't get acquainted really, and they don't build a movement that way. And the only way you can build a movement is by talking to each other a long time together. And with these webinars, I think it's happening. Yeah.
Some of that's happening that way. And as we've seen with this whole explosion of the Black Lives Matter stuff in the middle of the pandemic, sometimes when these crises intersect, people get out of the house anyway.
I don't see quite, there's no particular reason for me to think that the Black Lives Matter movement would have surged exactly when COVID did.
Oh, no, I don't mean that. I just mean that when a crisis like that comes to the fore, even though we were all told to shelter at home, thousands of people came out of their homes to protest anyway, and had that face-to-face contact.
And so far they don't seem to have caused any upsurge. I think it's because it was all out of doors.
It was outside. And I went to a couple of these protests and people wore masks and they were pretty good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tell me what you think is going to happen about automation, because I don't remember seeing a lot of discussion about it in your book. That, there's a real discussion among my friends about whether or not to believe that we're going to have a huge loss in jobs, or whether, as with other changes in technology and throughout the period of industrialization, there will be new jobs that emerge to take up for where the old ones left off. And I wonder what you think. Are we going to have to make work or give people handouts, or which I'm not necessarily opposed to at all, but or do you think that the economy will actually create conventional sense occupations?
I don't pretend to be expert in this area, but I would say this is not an area that I'm hugely worried about, at least not for the next 30 years, because actually converting our economies and societies for what we need to do to get off fossil fuels is such a big job that it's going to involve a lot of work. I actually think our larger problem, once we get serious about a Green New Deal, our larger problem will be a labor shortage. and at least for a couple of decades. And then the other part of the Green New Deal is to say it isn't just about electrifying everything and, you know, switching technologies. It's also about the caring economy and valuing the things we've come to value in this pandemic, the care for children, the care for the elderly. All of these forms of work that we traditionally leave to women, immigrant women, we pay crap, but interestingly, produce almost no carbon, no GHGs in the service economy that those operate in. And they are by definition jobs that are done by humans. That's how we care for each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you put a lot of emphasis, really it's important, the question of denial and how we get people psyched up for this challenge. That's something that I spend a lot of time trying to do, but I wouldn't say I'm a roaring success in changing public opinion. And I just don't really think we have a handle on that yet.
This is where we need real leadership from our governments. The thing about World War II is that you have to have a clear and consistent message. Whereas what we're experiencing with climate is a lot of very confusing message. You know, when Justin Trudeau passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day and reapproves the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day, that's confusing to people. In fact, why do we even, you know, one of the points I make in the book, why do we allow advertising for fossil fuel cars and gas stations? We don't for tobacco, because that's confusing. What does it mean to tell people that it's an emergency and then they see these ads? And overall, what our federal government and provincial governments have been saying to people, unlike what they said in World War II, is you don't have to choose. You don't have to decide. We can tackle climate and we can still double down and expand tar sands production and LNG in my province. And that's not being straight with people. But it's an attractive message, right? Because nobody wants to make hard choices. And so that perpetuates that sense of denial. And the mainstream media play right along with it. None of which is what happened in World War II. In World War II, we were much clearer about it. And the media was clear about it. The media, you know, you want the media to be factual and science-based. But when you're facing a global civilizational threat, the media should pick a damn side. And too often they don't. Mm-hmm. And too often they look. I mentioned a poll that I didn't do, but someone else did in the book. Even though the majority of Canadians say they want bold climate action, only about half of Canadians understand that the principal source of climate change is the combustion of fossil fuels.
Really?
The level, who knows, you know, often they just go right to plastics or recycling. Like the level of basic literacy is atrocious, but that's on the government and our other public institutions. If that's true, they have to fix it, right? In World War II, we saw maps every night on the news and on the radio where you saw the battle lines, you knew what the threat was. Every night we gathered around the radio in Canada. You were in the States. In Canada, everyone gathered around the radio every night to listen to Lorne Greene before he became a Hollywood actor. Mm-hmm. You know, in Bonanza and Battlestar Galactica, Lorne Greene was the voice of the CBC right through the Second World War. That great deep voice. It was called the Voice of Doom. And every night, Canadians across the country got the latest update from him. Where is that, right? That's how you start to tackle that confusion and that denial.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I have to say there were 2 or 3 things that if I were writing your book, I would have done differently.
Okay.
As you know, I'm much more oriented toward doing things internationally, transnationally. I'm very interested in organizing activists around the world and bringing people together. That's why I have these town halls and these meetings like you. You know, I interview people in India or Russia all the time, that sort of thing. So I think that I would love to see a future effort to link Canada much more into the world and
Mm-hmm.
look at Canadian policies in the context of global trends.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I wasn't opposed to your title for the book, A Good War, because I think that's great, but I have to say that neither you nor the Green New Deal people in general make any major reference to the importance of demilitarization
Mm-hmm.
as a component of the kinds of reforms that we have to do. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we can solve climate change without cutting back on our military.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that not only for the reason that that's where all our money is going, but it's a stupid way to waste money, but also because military production and the maintenance of a military force, it creates a lot of greenhouse gas,
Yes,
and we can't
absolutely.
afford to do it.
Yeah.
So I wish that we could hook your concerns up to some other concerns that I think form more of a system. I mean, with our project Save the World, we look at 6 different global threats because we think they're all related and that we can't solve any one of them without addressing at least one or usually 2 or 3 of the
Mm-hmm.
others. War and weapons and militarism being one, global warming being the other biggie. And then we have things like famine, pandemics, uh, radioactive contamination, and
Mm-hmm.
cyber attacks. And all of those together require economic changes of the kind that we've just been talking about.
That's right.
So it's this, our economic issues are not irrelevant whatsoever, but they are, these things I think are causally linked, and we should address them as such
Yeah.
because there's the solutions have to be as a system too.
Yeah. I mean, well, so maybe I should have spent more time
Shame on
than
you.
I did on all of those things. Although I do think I actually spent some time on almost all of them.
Okay.
I do talk, having lauded the creation of these 28 crown corporations in one chapter. One of my favorite chapters in the book is on Indigenous leadership and the climate mobilization.
Yes. Saw
And
that.
importantly, a number of those crown corporations left this terrible poisonous legacy on Indigenous territory in Sarnia, and to your point about nuclear radiation, for the Dene people in the Northwest Territories who were poisoned as part of
Absolutely.
the uranium they extracted for the Manhattan Project. And so the book does talk about that. I wrote the book for Canadians and about how we mobilize our country. But I do speak to the fact that this obviously is a global endeavor, and we have to do it knowing that millions of good people around the world are doing the same thing in their countries. I was trying to speak directly to this voice that a lot of Canadians have in their head, which is, oh, well, we're just a small country, a small population. What we do doesn't matter. And I wanted to say, first of all, it does matter. We have the highest per capita emissions in the world, and that's not counting what we extract and export to other countries. And 2, guess what? That's not what we did in the Second World War. We entered 2 years before the United States and before anyone else in the Western Hemisphere, and we were only 11 million people then. And at the end of the war, nobody doubted or questioned the importance of our contribution. So let's just
Absolutely.
do this.
And I love that notion that, because in fact, I think Canadians are a little bit parochial,
Yes,
thinking we couldn't really be the leaders in the world, but we
yes.
should.
But I do want to reinforce what you said before. There is, when we ask ourselves, why is it that this federal government that claims to get climate and yet still doubles down on pipelines and tar sands expansion and so on, and they literally basically say, well, if we don't do it, if someone else is going to do it. And so they're all, to put this in international relations terms, they're all caught in this classic prisoner's dilemma of nobody wanting to be the chump and doing what needs to be done only to be a sucker and have somebody else occupy that space. So I speak to that in the book. And I actually mentioned something in the book that I'm now actually working on, you'll be happy to know, on a little bit of contract work on the side, which is this new initiative for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I don't know if you've heard about this. You will be hearing more about it. It is modeled on the original nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and it is an international initiative, and it is trying to speak to the fact that the Paris Agreement has a fatal omission, which is that nowhere in the Paris Agreement does it mention fossil fuels, oil, gas, or coal.
I didn't realize that.
And that's the result of years of successful lobbying from those industries. And so the Paris Agreement only speaks to the demand side. How do we lower demand? And it doesn't speak at all to the production side. And so this initiative is saying we need a new international treaty, a companion treaty to the Paris Agreement that is about ramping down production in a cooperative way that gets us out of, it's a path out of the prisoner's dilemma, effectively.
Wonderful.
And so people can look up Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty online. You can find the webpage. And I do also in the book speak to the fact that one of the key lessons of the Second World War is that Canada is not an island. And we don't do this alone. And we also have to see these international connections, the biggest of which is as a wealthy, well, two really. First of all, as a wealthy country, what does this mean in terms of financial and technology transfers to the poorer countries that are hardest hit by climate change? And secondly, when I spoke earlier about the cautionary tales from the Second World War, one of which is how Canada responded to refugees before, during, and after World War II. And it was abysmal, as anyone who's looked at this knows.
Right.
And so what does that mean as we now face down the issue of climate migration and what will be a defining issue of the next 50 years? And will we react? Will we replicate that shameful history again, or will we act honorably this time?
Yeah. I hadn't even gone there. That's a hard one to predict. Yeah. And I had not heard about this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I love it. But I wonder how it connects with something I have heard about, which is a campaign against subsidies for fossil fuels. And I don't know whether you link the two, but I was told that $5 trillion a year is spent globally on subsidies for fossil fuels. That is a place where we should publicize that number, We should say, this is how much we're actually paying to keep the damn thing going.
Yeah. Well, I do speak to that issue in the book, and that is a key piece of it. I mean, like all things, you grab hold of this thing wherever you can. So one piece of it is divestment. Another piece of it is getting rid of subsidies. I mean, whatever it takes to make these companies pay the full cost of the garbage they're producing, and make it uneconomic.
You're doing well, my friend. I'm very, very happy about how you've spent your life so far.
Thanks,
so congratulations on your book.
Thanks. Oh, so I should say people can go to my website. It's just sethklein.ca, and you can order the book or just call your local bookstore.
Seth Klein, is there a dot in there? Seth Klein?
No, just sethklein.ca.
Okay.
And I think the book endeavors to be realistic about how serious this crisis is, but I also think it's one of the more hopeful books on the subject you will read.
Well, it's one of the most fun to read, I'll tell you.
Oh, good.
I mean, not ha-ha fun, but entertaining in that you find things that you hadn't known before. Really lovely. Good. It's been wonderful talking to you. Good
nice
wishes.
Talking to you.
Let's stay in touch. Okay.
All right.
No more 25 years in between.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Seth. All good wishes. Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.